and we're going to listen to a lecture that was given by Joel S. Bayden, not Biden, just Bayden. Anyway, and he's a professor of Hebrew Bible at Yale Divinity School. He's the co-author with Candida R. Moss of Bible Nation, the United States of Hobby Lobby, and Reconceiving Infertility, Biblical Perspectives on Procreation and Childlessness. He lives in New Haven, Connecticut. He's born in 1977, and he goes from place to place, just rocking the boat about the Old Testament and the Hebrew Bible and telling people what it really is. He has a lot of really good books. So we're going to hear not necessarily his perspective, but him as being an actual member of Israel or actual, I don't even know if he is Jewish, because I assume he was born Jewish, but I don't know if he's even a practicing person. But we're going to hear from him what he says the truth is.
So, welcome everyone to this beautiful and historic Watch Hill Chapel. I'm Andrew Parsons. I'm Vice President of the Watch Hill Chapel Society. We had a very successful program of interfaith speakers last year, and my fellow trustees agreed to support a 2023 free admission summer program of both concert evenings and a speaker series. We had the first concert by the Pacific String Quartet last Saturday, and it was a phenomenal event. And today we have the first of three talks that I've grouped under the title, Solving the Mysteries of the Scriptures. A fairly mysterious title, but we will see how each of the speakers interprets that. You can see the whole program on the handout, which is at the back of the
introduction. Thank you all.
It's absolutely worth seeing, which is what use is the Bible. And you will find out that it is very useful, but not necessarily in the ways you think. Anyway, so let me introduce Joel Bayden, and thank him very much for coming to talk to us.
Take a bottle of water. Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you all for being here. Can everyone hear me? Carol, all the way in the back? Okay.
I'm going to turn my mic off, and let me know if you can still hear the video when I turn my mic off.
I'll talk quieter then. A special thank you, obviously, to Andrew and to Jackson for inviting me here. Before I jump in, let me say just a little bit about me, very little, since some of it was just covered. The most important thing, I suppose, is I am a Jewish professor at a Christian divinity school. And I have been for almost 20 years at the school. I've been Jewish longer than that. That's kind of a wild thing to do and to be, but it certainly has given me a lot of opportunity to think about what I think we're doing with the Bible. I teach a community at Yale that is pretty diverse, aside from everyone being Christian, so not maybe too unlike this space. Yale's not a seminary where we're teaching the students what to think or believe. I have a classroom full of Episcopalians and Catholics and Lutherans and Presbyterians and evangelicals and so many ex-evangelicals. I'm going
to say this. No, they are not telling people what to believe. But what most people are going to say who really are attached to the idea of what the Bible is, they're going to say the same thing I said when I went to a liberal arts school or school, which is they're really trying to fundamentally break people down to remove them from Christianity by having him there to teach, because this is the same thing that my sociology teacher, she actually encouraged us to go read another Bible besides the Bible, another spiritual text or religious text that was not the Bible or Bible based. And she told us to open our minds to this. So when I first was in college the first time, I thought, wow, that's interesting. I appreciated it, but at the same time, I was thinking that when I left, I thought, oh, they're trying to water people's faith down, right? And so when we go to church, like I said, they said don't read any other books. But so now you have Yale, people are in Yale and Harvard's like the top minds, and you wonder why certain people don't really have the same ethics or morals or the same viewpoint as you, as a person who maybe doesn't go to such a prestigious scholastic school. And you're like, okay, because I feel like what they're doing is teaching them critical thinking and giving them this tool. If you got this man right here who can give you a tool that shows you exactly where he knows that the Bible comes from, then it changes how more wealthy people see it, right? Because we go around learning that the Bible, or that the root to all evils is money, and so they begin to learn, maybe that's not exactly true. You know what I mean? Like maybe that changes their outlook. Because I always wondered how rich people, if the Bible was root to all evil, then, and they still go to church, how come they aren't taking it as hard as poor people? You know what I mean? Or, I don't know if that makes sense to you guys.
There would be no way for me to say something about what they should all commonly think or believe, even if I were inclined to do so, which as a Jew, I'm really not. So what I teach is a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today, which is the history of.
Sorry, because he says, I am not inclined, right? And to me, that was condescending, I think, because he's not necessarily inclined to tell them what to think. But maybe he's not saying it the way that I interpret it, but the way I interpret it is like, the truth. And it's like, you're basically like laughing at everybody for not knowing this truth. And if they don't like it, so be it. I know we're not supposed to force people to think what we think, but I just feel as he goes along, it's like he's really making fun of people in a way. I don't know. Tell me, Terry, because I saw you start laughing. And we just getting started. So I was already like, what?
I haven't watched the video, so I want to see what he has to say before I make a real comment on it. But
okay.
It's kind of a just his wording is kind of interesting. So let's see what he has to say.
The text, which we all share, whether we want to acknowledge that or not. And rather than what to think about the Bible, how to think about it. I think, to be quite honest, that I have the greatest job in the world, and I'm looking forward to sharing a little bit of it with you. So my task today, much appreciated, was to speak about creating the Hebrew Bible. And at least I wasn't given a particularly broad topic. How to go about that kept me up at night a little bit. The various parts of the Hebrew Bible all have different literary histories. The Pentateuch, the first 5 books, are different in their literary history from the books of Joshua through Kings. The prophets have their own histories, each of them distinct from the others. Psalms are different still, and Proverbs and Chronicles. Not that anyone has ever cared about Chronicles. I have spent my entire career basically working just on literary history of the Pentateuch. I could give you a 10-lecture series on the Pentateuch alone and still not cover it all. We'll talk about that later. So while I'm going to touch on all of these various texts over the course of the next however long I end up speaking, 4 or 5 hours, we're all good for that, right? Okay. This is going to be something of a bird's eye view of how the Hebrew Bible came to be. And of course, I'll spend some time talking about why I think it matters in the end. Before we get into how the Hebrew Bible came to be, I'd like to take a moment to think about what the Hebrew Bible actually is. And I don't mean sort of like conceptually, what is the Bible to us, but like literally. When you pick up your Bible here at Watch Hill, and they are sitting in the pews in front of you, don't pick it up now. When you turn to the first part of it, that is the Old Testament Hebrew Bible, what are you actually looking at? Well, in your Bibles, I'm fairly certain you will see the book of Ruth coming after the book of Judges. And I'm pretty sure that you would find that just before you get to the New Testament, you're reading all the prophets. And that means that you're not reading the Hebrew Bible. That means you're reading the Old Testament. And you might think, well, what's the difference? They are basically the same books, though they are in a different order, arranged in the New Testament to lead prophetically into, in your Bibles, right? The Old Testament is arranged to lead into the New Testament, right? So the prophets come at the end as prophecies of what is about to come, which is not the case for the Hebrew Bible or the Jewish Bible, in which the prophets are smack in the middle, and we end with Chronicles. In short, the Old Testament is a Christian book and it goes before the New Testament. The Hebrew Bible is a Jewish book, and it goes before nothing. More accurately, maybe even, the Hebrew Bible is a collection of ancient Israelite literary works. And that's the context, ancient Israel, in which, and importantly for which, these texts were created. Even beyond the Old Testament / Hebrew Bible nomenclature issue, what is it that you're actually reading? Unless you are an Orthodox Jew, I think I'm in the clear, you have always encountered the Bible in translation. Whether it's English or whatever your vernacular language of choice happens to be, maybe in Latin, if there's some old school Catholics out there. And while you were reading your Bible, you probably thought, hey, I'm reading the Bible. But you were reading a translation. And all translations are interpretations. They all involve choices that are largely invisible to the reader. What were those translators actually translating? Every modern translation of the Hebrew Bible is based on a single manuscript. It is the oldest complete text of the Hebrew Bible that we have in the world, and it is from the 11th century CE. So like not BCE, like the recent 11th century, like less than 1,000 years ago. Or to put it another way, around 2,000 years after the earliest biblical texts were probably composed. So your Bible, your text that your Bible is based on, the Hebrew that your translation is based on, is from the 11th century, 2,000 years after some of the biblical texts were written. And the question is, what do we think the chances are that that text remained perfectly stable for those 2,000 years between first being written and our manuscript? Again, the best biblical text we have is from the Middle Ages. We have really very little way of accessing what the original authors of these texts might have wanted us to read. Another layer of difficulty, that one manuscript that all of our modern translations are based on, like every manuscript out there, has typos. Right? I mean, you imagine having to hand copy the entirety of the Bible. It's a mistake here and there. Many modern translations are aware of these mistakes. We compare that manuscript to other ones, and we figure out where something's gone wrong, perhaps. So modern translations often are aware of these and will correct these errors, often without letting you know that they're doing so. Other translations, like the King James, famously, doesn't fix those errors. So for some readers, what we know as scholars are essentially typos, are part of the Bible. And I don't want to get ahead of the rest of the lecture series, but On top of that issue, there's the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are way older, right? 2nd century BCE in some cases, so way older than our like best manuscript of the text. The problem is there are a lot of places where the Dead Sea Scrolls version of the Bible differs from our version of the Bible. But that one's older. You'd think maybe it should get more credit than the one from 1,000 years later. And then there's the Septuagint, which is the name we give the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, which is from the 3rd century BCE, probably. But it turns out that the Greek translation, this very old Greek translation, isn't even translating the same text that we have as our Hebrew Bible today. For example, in the Greek version of the Bible, the book of Jeremiah is a 1/6 shorter than it is in the Bible in front of you in the pews. I hope nobody's faith was like deeply based on that 1/6 of Jeremiah. Point, if it's not clear yet, is that there really is no the Hebrew Bible. Our English Bibles are modern translations of a single 11th century medieval manuscript with its typos 2,000 years after the biblical texts began to be set down, with no recognition really at all that there are older versions of the text out there that have better claims to antiquity and are often starkly different. If that's not enough to shake your confidence in the Hebrew Bible, let's talk about what's in it and where all that stuff comes from. Oh, well. Fine. The Hebrew Bible, of course, is not really a book, even though it is bound between 2 covers. It's more accurately a library. It's a collection of writings from ancient Israel, spanning nearly a millennium of that community's existence. It consists largely of attempts to understand and define Israel's relationship with its God. Largely, but not entirely. There's love poetry in there, in Song of Songs. There's the Book of Esther, in which the deity makes not a single appearance. I'm going to talk later on about how the whole thing came together. But for now, I only want to point out that the literary works that are collected in this library are maybe a little bit more haphazard than is commonly thought. To put it another way, not a single book in the Bible was written to be a book in the Bible. Right? They may have ended up there, but they didn't have to. And other works that were written in the same places and times, indeed, didn't end up in there. This is due more to historical accident than to anything intentional, some overarching plan. These books happen to be the ones that are in this library, in this collection. More on that in a bit. This library of the Hebrew Bible is highly varied. There are stories, shorter and longer. There are laws, there's prophecy, there are poems and proverbs and genealogies and lists. There's doom and destruction, there's hope and even humor. The Hebrew Bible represents the vast majority of the existing literature from ancient Israel. So I guess it's a nice thing that it covers so many genres and styles. This is, of course, in contrast to the New Testament, which is like a tiny little sliver of the entirety of Greco-Roman literature. So they've got all of this wonderful stuff to compare their texts with, and this is what we got from ancient Israel. My point, again, is that these ancient Israelites weren't writing the Bible, right? They were writing literature in their own vernacular, in their native literary genres. Okay, that's enough of generalities. And now I'm going to get into the nitty-gritty, as I'm sure you're all sitting there thinking, why doesn't he just get to the good stuff? And fine, if you're going to be pushy about it, I will. The oldest texts preserved in our Hebrew Bible, the very oldest, probably date from the 11th or 10th century BCE. So having said that, that's a long time ago. Having said that, let me start with this observation. Even if the Hebrew Bible is old, it is not the oldest, nor is it particularly unique. It draws on and imitates sometimes even almost plagiarizes ancient Near Eastern literature that predates it sometimes by more than a millennium. Everyone's favorite creation story in Genesis 1, in the beginning, etc., is a clear variant of a Mesopotamian creation myth from the second millennium BC. The story of Moses' birth, right? The basket and the reeds and all that is a nearly identical story to an Akkadian legend from 2300 BC. Some of the laws that we find in Exodus are basically verbatim from the famous Code of Hammurabi from around 1800 BCE. Some of the rituals we find in Leviticus, and this is where you all have to nod and be like, I know just what you're talking about. I read Leviticus all the time. Rituals in Leviticus are strikingly similar to ones we know elsewhere from the region from the 14th century BCE. There is a section of the book of Proverbs. It's like 3 chapters of Proverbs that are, as far as you can see, really lifted word for word from an Egyptian text from the 13th century BC. The Hebrew Bible is very old to us, but let's not get carried away. In my opinion, the oldest text in the Hebrew Bible is the poem that we find in Judges 5, sometimes known as the Song of Deborah. Y'all look at it in your own time. Or, flip to it if you like. This is a song of military victory. And most notably for our purposes, it's a song about how the various Israelite tribes coordinated with each other to fight off their common Canaanite foe. And what makes this poem, to my mind, seem quite old is not just its language, though it does have what feels like an older register of Hebrew. You have to remember, every language changes over time. The English we speak today and the English of 1,000 years ago are so different as to be, I can't read that stuff. Chaucer's pretty tough, right? So Hebrew's the same. You can tell when you're and Zebulun and Issachar and Reuben and Dan and Asher and Naphtali. Great. But also, perhaps less expected, the tribe of Machir and Gilead and Meroz. The tribe of Judah makes no appearance, or Simeon or Manasseh or Levi or Gad. So you got this weird list of tribes participating in this battle. And what this suggests is that this song, this poem, comes from a period of Israel's history before that 12-tribe system that we're familiar with came to be solidified. Now, those of you familiar with the story of the Bible may be thinking, hold on, the 12 tribes go back to Jacob's sons in Genesis, all the way back at the beginning. And to that I will tell you that there is a pretty significant gap between the history of Israel and the story of Israel's past that the Bible tells us. I don't want to open too big a can of worms, but I will. All I'm doing today is opening lots of cans of worms and then letting them loose among you. I will let you. The secret I will let you in on is there was no idea of this 12 tribe like that. That 12 tribe idea doesn't exist in history until the reign of King David. But that is a different lecture, I'm afraid. I have to keep you wanting more. So this old poem, Judges 5, this old tribal military victory poem, it's not obviously just floating in space in the text. It's been taken up and embedded in a story, the story of the prophet and judge Deborah. That story is itself part of a collection of stories about Israel's early leaders, these judges. And that collection of stories about judges is in turn part of a longer narrative about Israel's transition from individual tribes to a nation with a king. And that story is finally one of the textual sources for an overarching history of the period from the death of Moses through the Babylonian exile. And here's the dilemma that I face. How do I talk about the creation of the Hebrew Bible when even a single chapter is just so complicated? Any ideas? I didn't have one. Okay. Let me focus for a second on the basic literary process that I've just described, which is to say the taking up and reusing of earlier pieces of literature. All of our oldest Israelite literature is found in this way as reused text. So the oldest bits we have are all like that poem, right? And they're mostly all poetry. Judges 5, Exodus 15, sometimes known as the Song of the Sea, Genesis 49, Deuteronomy 33. These are these poems that are we find in the text. They're older not because poetry is like somehow older as a genre than prose, but because biblical poetry presents itself as having been spoken by someone at some time, and it thus lends itself to being put into the mouths of characters in stories. It's not so different from a modern novelist having one of their characters, sing "Rockabye Baby" to a child. Right? The lullaby existed before the novel, right? But it's not like lullabies as a genre are older than prose. In any case, what we're really talking about here is how one text takes up another one, building on and around it in the creation of something new. And it's not just old poetry that this happens to. There's pretty good reason to think that this whole cycle of tales about Israel's judges, right? Deborah, but Samson and others in there, that we find now in chapters 3 through 17 of the book of Judges, that this probably once existed as an independent collection. Right? There's like a cycle of stories about the judges that once had its own individual existence, but now we have it as part of a larger book. And that book is itself part of an even longer, broader history of Israel. So continuing to talk about this region of the Bible, the books of Joshua through Kings. So you get through the Pentateuch and Moses dies, and you get Joshua, and then Judges, and then Samuel, and then Kings. These books are understood by scholars to be one big literary block, a carefully constructed history of Israel's journey from the conquest of Canaan all the way through the fall of Jerusalem and the exile in Babylon. But this history is constructed out of bits and pieces of pre-existing literary materials. Right? This is not like a modern day historian sitting down and writing. This is like a student plagiarizing, right? Like finding a bunch of books that tell that story and then being like, well, I'll take this chapter from this one, I'll take this chapter from this one, etc. The historian responsible for these books was essentially a collector, an editor. He took various narratives that covered the time period he was interested in, and he brought them together. Sometimes they contradict each other.
I was going to say, much
or
like
create
we're
narrative
doing right
inconsistencies.
now.
But he doesn't seem to have cared. The historian seems not to have worried. He tossed in stuff from all kinds of sources, royal archives, or older collections of poems. In fact, he sometimes cites them. He says, and here's a thing that I found in this book. And he made it all into a semi-coherent whole by adding his own ideological editorializing statements at key moments throughout the history. So as an example, we read in the book of Samuel all about this David guy you might have heard of, who, as far as the story goes, if you have really read your book of Samuel, was a traitor and a philanderer and a murderer many times over, an extortionist.
So for you, Terry, you guys were listening to it it was a different language, and they would just tell you, like, how, when you listen to stories, like, did they tell you any of these stories? Did you ever get like a English translation of it when you were there?
No. And actually these like the Old Testament stories we didn't really know about them. They didn't really talk about them. A lot of stuff was lost in translation for me. So, it was always like the New Testament that was being quoted. I'm not saying that the other stuff wasn't, but if it was, it just was beyond me. So,
True. Yeah, it was
although
true.
I did, in the Bible school, I read about things and I did read about it in the Bible, but it was so like, I couldn't understand a lot of it.
And Chastity, for you had an experience with it.
Yeah.
Those Old Testaments messing up your flow there.
Yeah, the Old Testament, it was like they only taught the major stories, like David and Goliath, Saul and David, the Battle of Jericho, of course, the creation story, and
you got to talk about how they walked around the walls of Jericho and they knocked it down.
Yeah, that always made everybody scream and shout.
Yeah.
Literally.
Or with Lot's wife. They talked about Lot's wife, don't look back. But they didn't ever make it to that part where Lot's daughters, because now his wife is dead, try to have sex with him after they get him drunk. So they usually skip that story. That part of the story too.
And they didn't skip the part, of course, that they wanted to talk about how, it's wrong to have sodomy or same-sex relationships. They took that one and ran with it. And let's see, I'm trying to remember.
So then they did, but then Noah and his sons get really excited about seeing daddy naked. So they it's a lot. There's like some
one of them covers him up and the other one doesn't. And
yeah, he doesn't have shame. He's like, dang, dude.
Yeah. And then of course there's the one that sold his birthright and for a bowl of beans. And then of course they talk about the golden calf. That's when they start making you afraid of money, of having wealth. And of course, the parting of the Red Sea and the story of Moses. It was like just general stories like that they told. Esther, and they didn't really get into the other stuff. That was what I remember teaching as in Sunday school. Those and Jonah and the whale, of course.
Right.
Yeah.
And David's story is amazing because he actually is like a really crappy person. But this is the first time I've ever heard somebody just straight up say, yeah, he was a jerk, because he sent a guy to war and made sure that he was first in line because he seriously just wanted to have sex with his wife.
Yep.
And then now that you got his wife pregnant, you send him out to get killed first.
Yep.
But that's after. But wait a minute. You bring him home from his men so he can have sex with his wife, so you can make sure that if he comes home and she's pregnant, that he can say, "Yeah, I had sex with my whatever." But this is the first time usually when I see people go deep into David, it's like you want the love of God and you're a really bad person. So no matter what you did, you can compare the person to David. And because he was beloved by God, right? He really disappointed and hurt God. And
he was called a man after God's own heart.
This is the first time I'm ever hearing somebody call him this, which now in plain sight, that's what he was. But usually, I guess I think you can tell if your pastor is struggling with something by what verses he talks about, because whatever he's struggling with, that's what he's going to preach about. So if it's drinking and philandering, that person's always going to be talking about David. That's kind of what I learned.
Wow, I never thought about that, but yeah.
Oh, right. Because when we minister, and I've learned this even with self-help and with life coaches and stuff like that. What we're best at discussing is our own stuff. So when we minister, we're really ministering to ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So if that person's struggling with drugs and alcohol and women, they're going to talk about David a lot.
Yeah.
Basically an all-around thug. Again, that's probably a different talk for a different time. This story of David that told all that stuff, and he included it in this sort of epic. And it basically, that story of David that he picks up continues uninterrupted from start to finish. But right near the end of it, in the very first chapter of the Book of Kings and the very last chapter of David's life, suddenly, this guy, David, who has really never shown anything, any interest in anything other than his own power, ends up saying the following words to Solomon, his son. This is a guy who's murdered everyone, right? Like he's just a terrible dude. And he says to his son on his deathbed, "Keep the charge of the Lord your God, walking in his ways and keeping his statutes, his commandments, his ordinances, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, so that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn." That is the first, last, and only time in the entire multi-book story of David that he ever mentions the law of Moses or any of the other nice things that he just said there. That's not David of the story we've read about David. It's not the original narrative about him. This is the editor, the historian, tying the David story, which he plucked from another source, into his overarching theme that Israel's history has been determined and judged by its adherence, or not, to the law of Moses. This is the argument the historian is trying to make, because he's writing during the Babylonian exile in the 6th century. He's trying to make sense of how Israel ended up in this terrible position. How do I know that's when he was writing? Because his history ends like on a Tuesday in the middle of the exile. And I'm pretty sure if he had known that the exile was going to come to an end and Israel would return from it, he probably would have said so. But if the history is from the 6th century, right, that is the broad sweep of Joshua through Kings, this editorial venture is from the 6th century, and Judges 5, that earliest bit, is from the 11th century, that's still 500 years of textual growth and development to get us from the beginning to the end of just that little piece of the Bible. Perhaps a more famous example of textual reuse is the formation of the Pentateuch. And maybe I should have started there because, that is the beginning after all. And as we all know, beginning is a very good place to start. But I did get distracted by the whole Judges 5 oldest text thing. And so anyway, here we are. So just to get it out of the way, or whatever it's worth, despite what tradition has taught, the Pentateuch was not written by Moses. Readers have been aware of that Moses didn't write the Pentateuch since the medieval period, and scholarship had basically given up on the idea by the 7th.
I have a thought too. I think it's a defense mechanism because people will want to argue with him. So he's like, no big deal. It's no big deal. like, but if this was the first time you were hearing this information to you, you'd be like, I wish you could see the people in the audience, like their face has to be like, you know what I mean? Like, I can't imagine that you just learned all that. And then it was like, oh my God, I never thought of it that way. That he snatched a story from somewhere else. And okay. And I don't know. Anyway.
18th century. There are lots of reasons for thinking Moses didn't write it. Not least that the text narrates Moses' death, which is a tough trick to pull off. And there are references to historical events that took place long before the time or long after.
Did you hear them laughing just now? They were like, oh. Because these are people who teach or preach and read, and they were like, oh, I never thought of it.
At the time of Moses, I will admit my favorite reason for not attributing the Pentateuch to Moses is that it includes the following sentence, which would be truly hilarious had Moses been the one to write it. Now Moses was the most humble man on earth. Anyway, not going to worry about Moses having written the Pentateuch. What I will say is that the Pentateuch is not so unlike the history from Joshua through Kings that we just talked about. It's a mushing together of previously independent texts to tell a continuous story. In this case, the story from the creation of the world through the death of Moses. Unlike in the books that follow, however, the editor of the Pentateuch, whoever it was who put this all together, didn't feel the need to imprint his own literary creation with his own editorializing comments. So like that line I quoted from that is put into David's mouth, there's nothing like that in the Pentateuch. There is no overarching ideology to be found in it. It is rather merely the story of Israel's early history as told by multiple divergent, contradictory sources, which have been combined into a running narrative. The example, I give of this is if you were to ask somebody from Watch Hill and somebody from Alabama to give you a history of the Civil War, you get two pretty different stories. Right? They'd agree on a bunch of the stuff, but the emphases would be different, and the who's right and who's wrong. Lots of stuff would be different. And now imagine that you had each of those two histories, and you were trying to write your own history. Somebody many years from now, and they found the Watch Hill version and the Alabama version, and said, "I don't know, okay," and put them both together. That's how you end up with, for instance, two creation stories in Genesis 1 and 2. They cannot possibly go together. This is how you end up with a flood story in a few chapters later in Genesis, right? Our story of Noah and the flood, a story that is so riddled with internal inconsistencies that despite the song, the animals, they came on by twosies, right? That song, despite the song, no one could actually tell a biblically accurate story of the flood. When you want to on your own time, go ahead and open to Genesis 6 and read chapters 6 through 9, and then you come back to me and you try and tell me the story, and good luck to you. This is how we end up with things like Moses getting water from a rock in the middle of the wilderness twice in two different places at two different times. This is how we get law codes in the Pentateuch that blatantly contradict each other over and over again. I could go on, like I said, I could do 10 lectures on this and not be close to done. My point is, the Pentateuch, it turns out, is a combination of 4 once independent sources that have been interwoven into a new unity that none of those sources themselves could possibly have imagined. I happen to think that trying to disentangle those sources from each other is just about as much fun as solving any mystery, which is why this is what I do professionally. But we don't have time for that here. That is now a 3rd different lecture that I'm not giving for those who are keeping score. Okay, here's where it gets complicated. More complicated. I can tell you basically when the Pentateuch was put together, right? I mean, I told you before, Joshua through Kings was put together in the exile, and I know that because that's when the story ends. But I can tell you when the Pentateuch was put together, and the answer is actually sometime in the 5th or 4th century BCE. How do I know that? Because the only other texts in the Bible that seem to have any idea that there was such a thing as a Pentateuch are from that time. And here's my favorite example. I said a minute ago that the Pentateuch is full of contradictory laws. So one of those contradictions comes in terms of how it is that you are to prepare the lamb that is sacrificed on Passover. In Deuteronomy, we are told you are to boil the meat. And in Exodus, we are told explicitly you may not boil it or eat it raw. You must roast it in fire. What are you going to do? No one cares about that until we get to the book of Chronicles, around 400 BC. I told you Chronicles. I knew Chronicles was going to come back. Chronicles comes to tell the story of one of its great heroes, the King Josiah. And Josiah, Chronicles tells us, offered the Passover sacrifice. How did he do it? One might ask. And it tells us, Josiah boiled the lamb in fire, according to the law, right? So you can see right around the time that we suddenly get texts that not only refer to the Pentateuch as a piece of literature, they're also clearly trying to figure out what to do with this weird text with all of its contradictions. So we can see when the Pentateuch emerges onto the scene for other biblical writers. Okay, so roughly the 5th or 4th century BCE. That's fine for the Pentateuch, like the whole thing. What about the sources, the pieces that went into making it? Here's where it gets hairy. I can tell you that they were all obviously completed by the time the Pentateuch was put together. But when were they started? I could venture some guesses. One maybe in the 9th century, maybe one in the 8th century, maybe one in the 7th century. I'm not just making, like, I actually think that's when I wasn't just counting down. But we would be mistaken if we thought about these literary works as the products of like a single person sitting down and writing a thing from start to finish and sending it off to the publisher and then seeing it on Amazon. But that's not how things worked back then. Every one of these sources of the Pentateuch, these 4 previously independent texts, has its own complicated literary history. We can see layers of editing within them, sometimes relatively minor expansions, a verse or a word here and there, sometimes nearly full-scale revision, including the addition of multiple chapters. These works, like most biblical books, were the products of schools, not of individuals. Schools that were active over many generations and even many centuries. So this process, that is the revision of existing literature, this is a process we see across the entire Hebrew Bible. And it's actually it's central to understanding what it is that we're reading in our biblical text. We tend now, for our own reasons, to think of the Bible as like a timeless text, right? But we can't forget that it was written and revised in specific historical and cultural circumstances and contexts. What we're looking at in the Bible isn't just an attempt to explain the world, right, or to understand Israel's relationship with its God. What we're looking at is actually the constant drive to make sense of everything that's happening in the world as the world changes.
And that's just it. The world changes. It's so funny because he said there were so many different, like 2 different stories and 2 different chapters of creation. I was just looking at this. It said God had a conversation with Adam and Eve and the serpent. So he was talking to a snake. I was talking to Adam and Eve, and a serpent walks. That's the part. So he's talking to them, and a snake actually like walks into the garden and punishes Adam and Eve for their actions. So does the snake punish them, or did God punish them? I don't know. But either way, the snake was walking. So that made me think about all those walls in Egypt where on the wall, people look at those 2 electrodes that are pointing, and they will say that those 2 electrodes are this snake. No, they're saying that it's a light bulb, but it has a snake in it.
Mm-hmm.
Because what you don't see on the rest of the wall is there's a snake, and then there's the electrode. So it's almost like it's in like an aura bubble is what I saw. And then after that, there's the other aura bubble. And then when you really go down the wall, there's literally a snake standing up in a man's bodysuit, and the snake is walking. It has a head and it has a body like the rest of the Egyptian gods. So to me, that was like some type of transition, right? Something completely different from light bulbs and whatever different, people say, come take my class, and I don't know. That's just what I saw. But we're going to sum this one up, Terry. So far, so good. And then we're going to end this part of the recording because we're going to pause, remember? And then do the rest of it. Okay. So far, so good. What you ladies thinking so far? You got to unmute yourself.
I like what he's talking about. When I went back myself and was looking at the scriptures and trying to see a timeline of things, and then understand the differences, like what one of them that he mentioned was the boiling versus the fire. That was one that got me. I remember seeing that. And then the creation story, as the Sunday school teacher and director, I was like, that doesn't even make any sense, because why do we teach it's 2 by 2? Because it's talking about 7. If you go back and look, it talks about there's 7 of each.
I'm going to show them one at a time. So it says in 620, it says 2 of everything.
Mm-hmm.
Then it says
7 pairs
of 2.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't remember if this ever dawned on me or not, because it's been a long time since I was into the thug life, prostitution, and all the other. I was like, "What? Y'all got a lot of sex in here. This is like a soap opera." That's how I was like, "What is? It's a lot."
Well, one of the people that I started following when I was trying to understand and untangle all of the different translations and the errors was this minister named Perry Stone. And he actually, I loved watching him, because he would do research into history and everything. And he actually addressed the serpent that walked upright. And there are actually skeletons that have been found that show a serpent walking upright. And like, it had a whole skeletal system that supported it to do that. And then, of course, he talks about how God cursed the serpent because he tricked Adam and Eve into partaking. And so he cursed him to walk on his belly. And that's how we have our snakes that we have now. And but those snakes that walked upright, They were tall. Some were really tall. So they were, the size of a regular human at that time. I thought that was really interesting. And
so were they to the reptilian race?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he actually got off into the reptilians. And I stopped watching him at a certain point just because he started getting really churchy and I couldn't handle it. But he was really good. He talked about the giants and he did all the research into the giants, and he taught this to his congregation. And I always wanted to move and go to his church. But yeah, he's got some really interesting. I don't know if they're still available. I saved them onto a hard drive. I have all of those sermons that he taught his congregation, where he was educating them about what did the different things, like he addressed the breastplate of the priests and what it all stood for. And he really went in depth, and that was what I liked, because I'm a researcher. I want to know that stuff.
Darn it. What's the name of that garden? There's a garden. Do you remember?
I will have.
Are you talking about over by the Tigris and the Euphrates?
No. Okay, hold on a second. I'm going to look it up. But Terry, you wanted to say something?
Well, now I was just going to say, like, how many books are there in both the Old Testament and the New Testament? Like 66?
66.
Meanwhile, they say there's like over 700 there's over 700 different scriptures. And so it was decided by the Nicene Council which ones to put into our Bible. So it's like, well, there's a lot of information that is not, that we don't have any access to, because they didn't want to talk about stuff. So
yeah,
what we should believe. They like to tell us what we should believe.
When I was studying about the Council of Nicaea, I found that the Emperor Constantine took this priest that had been put into prison for changing the books of the Bible when he was doing the translations for the different congregations that they wrote for, because they would create the scrolls or books that would go to other areas where they would went to school and church people, and they didn't allow the people to be able to read them. So in this translation, this priest that got in trouble. I don't have my notes, so I can't give you his name, but he was changing it so subtly that nobody was catching on, but then somebody did, and he got charged and put into prison for changing, because you're not supposed to change a dot or a tittle. And he was doing that very subtly. Well, when Constantine took over as the head of the church, because he was trying to save his empire, then they had the Council of Nicaea. He got this guy out of prison and said, I want you to help me take out the mystical parts of the Bible, so that, because nobody else deserves to know that stuff, it needs to be dumbed down for the average person, and the spiritual mystical stuff kept for us that are learned. And then that's also when they started doing the relics and, paying for people to make it to heaven and stuff like that. It became a business after that. And then that's when Luther started saying, no, they deserve to know what it actually says for themselves.
So that's Oslo in Norway, right? And they have all these statues. Oh, crazy statues. I don't know what he's doing with these babies. That might not be a regular baby. Is that what it is? Maybe it's not a regular baby, or is he? I don't know what he's doing.
It looks like he's kicking the baby like a football.
Look at his head, though. The head is shaped different, like a long-headed baby or something.
Yeah.
He's like, okay, those little babies look angry. Jesus. They got lots of babies. Then this woman just running. There's more. There's people all piled up.
Yeah, they have some strange art over there. I don't know what it all means, but it's very weird.
Okay, the babies, clamoring babies. That's a lot of babies. We hadn't even gotten to the strangest one yet. Like, they're not showing it. Whoever this person was, they didn't show it. Let's see. This is one that they should show. Can you see that one? Oh gosh, it didn't do it. This does what it wants to do. I'm telling you. There's these with the reptiles. There's more. They're just showing that one. Oh, look at that. Oh, these must be the zodiacs right here.
That's the zodiacs, yeah. The wheel of life.
Why do they call this Scorpio? Shouldn't this be? That's a crayfish.
Oh no. Either a crayfish or a lobster.
Okay, they didn't want to show the ones with the reptiles, I guess. They didn't show all of them. They just showed that one. But yeah, so because that one was standing up. So anyway, that was that Oslo. Anyway, so we're gonna end this recording, and we're gonna give people's minds a break so they can talk trash. So we'll be back again. Here we go.